So after Tuesday's lecture, thinking about how many species share the planet with us now, and thinking back to Luca, the fact that there was a time in the history of life on Earth where there was just one type of organism, you're probably really chomping at the bit to learn how do we get from Luca to where we are now? How do we get from one species of life on Earth to tens or hundreds of millions of different species? And the answer is speciation. Speciation, the process by which one single population becomes subdivided and gives rise to two reproductively isolated daughter populations. That's speciation, and we'll talk about that today. But we'll also spend some time examining different species concepts. That is, different ways that we attempt to figure out how many species of elephant are there in Africa. Are there one species, two species? And where do we draw the line? How different do two populations need to be before we consider them belonging to different species? So a fun fact, the person who discovers a new species and is the first to describe it to science and write it up in a scientific journal, they get the privilege of naming that species. And you can name a new species anything you like. Well, there are certain guidelines, but you could name a new species after the habitat that you found it in. You could name it after some weird quirk of its biology or its natural history. You could name it something that reflects the way it looks. You could also name it after a person. And so Taylor Swift has a millipede named after her. Shakira has a parasitic fly named after her. Beyonce has an insect named after her. Michelle and Barack Obama both have species named after them. David Attenborough, famous nature commentator, has like 50 species named after him. Donald Trump, yes, he has a species named after him. You can look it up. Hitler, Mussolini, all have species named after them. And so sometimes we name species after humans. And so there's no right or wrong answers to this clicker question, but I'm just interested in seeing the views of people in this room. Is that cool? Is it a good idea? If you discovered a new species, might you name it after a person? You can't name it after yourself, but you can name it after somebody else if you want. One of my colleagues has like many species of yeast named after him. If you ever drink a sour beer, it's made from like a species of yeast that's named after Professor Lachance in our department. So is this okay? What do we think? Okay, all right, yeah, so most people think that's all right, and other people think maybe not. Okay, as I said, no right or wrong answers there. I will say that in my own field, in ornithology, most of the species of at least North and South American birds were named about 200 years ago. Maybe 300 years ago, people started giving official scientific names to the birds in North and South America. And it was very popular to name birds after people's friends or maybe political figures that they admired. With the result that we've got a lot of birds with what we call eponymous names, bird species that have been named after humans. And in many cases, these humans did things that we now find, that modern day people find fairly reprehensible. So this longspur on the left is this beautiful, cool bird that lives in the prairies, and it just had its name changed because it was originally named after a guy who was a general in the Confederate Army and who bought and sold human beings. And this little warbler on the right that lives up in the boreal forest was named after a fellow who, among other things, was a grave robber and desecrated like indigenous burial grounds and sold dead bodies for science. And so, because in ornithology, in the field of scientists that study birds, there's a lot of birds that are sort of saddled with the names of humans that we now find sort of reprehensible or immoral. A few years ago, there was a big grassroots initiative, mostly led by the students in our society, doing really good work, called Bird Names for Birds. And basically, a couple years ago, the American Ornithological Society, the major professional society that I and other bird researchers belong to, just passed a resolution that, okay, no more human names for birds. Any new species of birds that get discovered, we have to give them a name that describes something about the bird or something about the habitat or where they live or how they sound, but we're not naming any more birds after people. And moreover, birds that already are named after people, we are going to rename them. We're going to come up with new names for them. So it can matter, I think, because a lot of our bird names were just really mired down in a very racist and colonial legacy. So it can matter, I think, what the names that we give to a species. But probably more relevant to today's learning outcomes, to the learning outcomes for this course, it also can matter where we draw the line. How many species of African elephant are there in Africa, for example? And you might think, if you like elephants, most people like elephants, you might think that the only important thing is that we conserve elephants, and we want to know like how many elephants are there, say, in the continent of Africa, and our population size is going up or going down. It turns out that there are, they're going down, but also there's two different sort of types or populations of elephant in Africa. If you go to African lion safari, the ones you'll see are these so-called savanna elephants. They're very large bodied, they live out in the open, and they have a different social structure and different body size and different social behavior, and also very different genetics from these other elephants called forest elephants who live in forested regions appropriately. And based on DNA evidence, it seems as though the savanna elephants here and the forest elephants haven't actually interbred with each other, haven't engaged in gene flow for millions of years. And so about 10 years ago, forest elephants and savanna elephants were sort of split, where we originally recognized just one species of African elephant, now we recognize two. So does it matter? Well, there's about 400,000 elephants living in Africa. The vast majority of them are this kind, or the savanna elephant. There's only about 10 or 20,000 individual forest elephants on the continent of Africa. So it turns out that forest elephants meet the criteria of being critically endangered. Savanna elephants are not quite that endangered. So again, does this matter? Does this matter from the point of view of conservation, for example? And likewise, right whales are a group of whales that were, for hundreds of years, were hunted for their blubber, for whale oil by whaling vessels. And they were hunted almost to the brink of extinction. And since that time, there have been legal protections, and most whaling, commercial whaling, has been outlawed. But anyway, until recently, we thought that there was only one species of right whale in the world, and some of them lived in the Southern Ocean, so close to the South Pole. Some of them lived in the North Atlantic. Some of them live in the North Pacific. Recently, based largely on genetic evidence, but also based on lobbying by conservation groups, right whales were split. That is, we now recognize 3 distinct species of right whale. So we say, actually, the right whales in the North Atlantic, they are their own species. And the ones in the North Pacific, they are a different species. And the ones in the Southern Ocean are a third species. And it can be important because whereas the right whales in the Southern Ocean are recovering fairly well, there's thousands of individuals that they're recovering pretty well from the effects of whaling. Right whales in, say, the North Atlantic Ocean, this newly recognized species, have much, much lower population sizes and require a lot more legal protection. And so does it matter, what isn't the only important thing how many whales, right whales there are in the oceans? Not necessarily. They're recognizing a population as being a distinct species can provide really tangible conservation benefits. And this is because of the way that the endangered species legislation in Canada and the United States and international law is structured. So there's much stronger legal protections available. We can put in place stronger anti-poaching laws or habitat protection laws for endangered species than we can if we just say, well, the North Atlantic population of the right whale species is really, really small and declining. We're much better able to protect those animals if we recognize them as being a species in their own right. So there can be conservation ramifications. That doesn't mean that we can just call every single population its own species. There's got to be some criterion, some way in which we say, okay, how different do these three populations of whales need to be before we say there's three different species instead of just three different populations in the same species. So usually in this class, when we come to a troubling or a difficult problem, I just recommend that people think back to the origin of species. What would Charles Darwin say? What would Charles Darwin say about this? And especially somebody who wrote a book called On the Origin of Species, you would think that he would have really wise words to say about how we define a species. It turns out Charles Darwin's thoughts of how we define a species are shown here. I don't know about you, but I find them sort of vague and ultimately unsatisfying. He's like, well, I can't really define it. No, there's no universal consensus, but we all basically know what we mean when we talk about a species. It is true that no one definition of a species satisfies everyone. It's not true, I would argue, that everyone knows what we mean when we talk about a species. So let's dive into that. Back in the day when Darwin was writing the morphological species concept, until about the middle of the 20th century, this is the only species concept out there. We call it now the morphological species concept. We say that two individuals or two populations are members of the same species if they look the same. And if they look different, then they belong to different species. More precisely, we define a species as representing a distinct cluster in phenotypic space that does not overlap with other such clusters. So to give you an example, this is just an overly simplified example because I can only draw in 2 dimensions on this board. But imagine that we have we have a number of, I don't know what they are, they're wolves or something. Each of these points is an individual wolf or some sort of canine. And for every individual, we know we've measured its body mass and we've also measured the length of its snout. And we want to apply the morphological species concept and say, how many species are we dealing with here? And so if the distribution was something like this, where there is a fairly discrete break, then we could use the morphological species concept to say, okay, there's 2 distinct clusters in phenotypic space. We're dealing with 2 different species. Everybody on this side of the line belongs to this species. Everybody on this side of the line belongs to the other species. So morphological species concept. So it allows for there to be some variation. It doesn't require that every individual look exactly the same in a species. The question is whether there are discontinuities in there. And if there are, then we say we're dealing with multiple species. And so Darwin, for example, as well as some others, used the morphological species concept to sort of shoot down the idea that some people were proposing around the time of Origin Species. Some people were proposing that humans actually comprise multiple different species, that people of different geographic origins might belong to different species. It seems sort of ludicrous now, but that was the idea in 1850s Europe, that, oh, people from different parts of the world look very different from each other. Probably we don't all belong to the same species. Using the morphological species concept, however, you can show that, yes, even though there's tons of variation in, say, morphology and the way that different people look, there's also every possible intermediate form for any trait you want to look at, whether it's height or shade of your skin or texture of your hair or whatever. And so there's really, humans just form sort of like one cloud with no real clear breaks or discontinuities. So humans, according to the morphological species concept, of course, are all members of the same species. So for a long time, the morphological species concept was the only species concept out there. There are problems with it, though, and one problem is that there's a lot of situations where the morphological species concept might reach conclusions that we think are just kind of silly or unserious. So one area where the morphological species concept runs into difficulty is if there is sexual dimorphism within a species, which a lot of species have. Males may look very different from females, and there may be few or no intermediate forms. So in these mandarin ducks up top, virtually every individual either looks like the guy on the left, a breeding male, or the individual on the right, a breeding female. And so if you were to apply the morphological species concept and map out, you would get two distinct clusters in phenotypic space, but it would be ridiculous to say that these correspond to two different species because these individuals are capable of mating with each other, and some of their offspring are going to look like the guy on the left, and some of their offspring are going to look like the lady on the right. So that's one area of difficulty with the morphological species concept is sexual dimorphism. But other forms of dimorphism or polymorphism within a species can also trip up the morphological species concept. So in these black bears, for example, black bears in southwestern Canada, some populations have a low frequency of a recessive allele that results in white coat color. And so in this case, we've got this white bear cub that is a descendant of his mama bear, who's a black bear. The morphological species concept might look at these two individuals and say, well, there's no in-between forms. None of the bears are like gray. So these two individuals belong to two different species. Again, it seems ridiculous to have individuals that belong to the same family group be classified as different species. Oh yeah, and more extreme still, you can imagine situations like frogs and other amphibians have like one stage of life, you might be a tadpole, and you might look very, very different from the adult form. And if you were to strictly apply the morphological species concept, are you going to say that these tadpoles change species as they reach adulthood? It would be silly. So the morphological species concept can often like oversplit what should be a single species. The other possibility is also out there. So sometimes the morphological species concept misses important variation. If we focus just on what things look like, these two birds in the hand look pretty much the same. I have difficulty telling them apart. It's a willow flycatcher and an alder flycatcher, but they look very similar to each other. And you might lump them together if you were using the morphological species concept just based on appearances, but they sing different songs, they live in different habitats, and individuals of one population can absolutely tell the difference between these two populations, and they only mate with individuals of their own population. So most people would consider them two different species, even though morphologically they look quite distinct. So cryptic Cryptic variation is what that's called, and it's a source of problems for the morphological species concept. So all these problems with the morphological species concept, I'd love to say that we've solved those problems by inventing like the best new species concept out there, but there's no universal species concept that everyone in biology can get behind, and there's maybe no one universal species concept that would be the best one. It hasn't stopped people from trying to develop new species concepts. What's the best way to delineate between two populations belonging to the same species or not? When I was in grad school, I took a course on species concepts, and we went through about 40 or 50 different species concepts, a few of which are shown here. We won't touch on all of these in this class, but just to give you a sense of the tremendous amount of thought that people give to how we should be defining different species. So in the middle of the 20th century, new species concept dropped called the biological species concept. And if any of you have studied species concepts in high school, this is probably the one that you are most familiar with. We define species based on reproductive isolation. Members of the same, two individuals belong to the same species if they share the same gene pool as each other. So a species is a group of individuals that is potentially interbreeding with each other, actually, or potentially interbreeding. And we say that two populations are different species if they are reproductively isolated from each other, if they don't or can't interbreed. Shared gene pool within a species, reproductive isolation between species. So the biological species concept places a lot of weight on how do things behave in their natural environment. It's mostly applied to animals, so I'll say, how do animals behave in their natural environment? In other words, do these two populations interbreed with each other freely under natural conditions? So for example, raise your hand if you've ever heard of a liger or a tigon. Yeah, okay. Everyone, lots of people have. Lions and tigers are considered different species, and whenever they come into contact with each other in the wild, they don't mate with each other. They don't consider each other suitable mates. However, if you capture a female of one species and a male of the other species, and you isolate them together, and you don't give them access to any members of their own species, eventually they will just become so lonely and frustrated that sometimes they will copulate with each other, and sometimes that will produce offspring that grow up into either a liger or a tigon, depending on which was the male parent and which was the female parent. It doesn't matter. We still don't consider lions and tigers to belong to the same species, even though you can get them to hybridize like under really weird, harsh, artificial conditions. Because in the wild, under natural conditions, they don't hybridize with each other. So even though ligons are a thing, or ligers are a thing, and tigons are a thing, they almost never really occur in real life. And so lions and tigers are considered different species. Horses and their relatives, so horses and donkeys are not as picky as the big cats. And so horses living in the wild, if they encounter a group of donkeys living in the wild, those individuals are usually not too choosy. They're happy to mate with each other. So horses and donkeys will actually freely interbreed under natural conditions. But we don't consider horses and donkeys to be all members of the same species either. Do we know why? Anyone know why? Yeah. Yes, their offspring, mules, are infertile. So even though they will interbreed with each other and they produce offspring, and the offspring grow up and are actually pretty strong, those offspring, those mules, are evolutionary dead ends. And so there's really no way for alleles from, say, the horse gene pool to get into the donkey gene pool. Not really. So the biological species concept says that for us to consider two populations being the same species, They need to freely interbreed with each other under natural conditions. Also, they have to produce hybrid offspring that are of essentially normal fitness. The hybrid offspring don't all die before they reach adulthood. The hybrid offspring aren't sterile like a mule is. So that's why mules and horses are considered two distinct species, not all members of the same species under the biological species concept. Is that clear so far? The biological species concept tends to be very appealing to people, at least people that study animals, because it seems to be more testable than, say, the morphological species concept. There's a nice objective criterion. Do they interbreed with each other, and are the hybrids of normal fitness or not? But there are, of course, situations where the biological species concept is not useful, where we can't actually use the biological species concept to determine whether we're dealing with one species or two. So here I've got a picture of some rotifers, which you may remember reproduce entirely asexually. Would it be helpful to use the biological species concept to try to work out how many species of rotifer were living in a lake? No, why not? Yeah, exactly. If nobody's mating with anybody else because they don't use sex to reproduce, then are we just going to call them all members of, each individual is its own species? So the biological species concept just isn't applicable if organisms are only reproducing asexually. What's another situation where we could not use the biological species concept? Yeah. Horizontal gene transfer? Oh, okay. Yeah, that might sort of trip you up. Yeah, because then are you going to call that sexual reproduction or not? And maybe it's introduced. Yeah, so that could sort of mess up our thinking about species. What if you dug up? Yes. Yes, extinct species. So if you are a paleontologist and you unearth maybe a new species of fossil human or a new species of dinosaur, you can't, all you've got are a pile of bones, and you can't ask this pile of bones if they would mate with another pile of bones in the next museum over. So it doesn't work on extinct organisms. I think you read in the pre-reading about the phenomenon of ring species, and this also poses a challenge to the biological species concept. In the textbook, the example it gives you, I believe, is on the Encentina salamanders around the Central Valley of California. But here's just another example of a ring species. This is the range of a bird called the greenish warbler in Europe and Asia. And so you see that all the colored areas are where the bird lives. So this whole ring of suitable habitat. And at most points along the ring, like this area here, the birds in this region shown in green are happy to mate with these birds living in the area shaded in blue, or the birds here in the green are happy to mate with the birds in the yellow. And these yellow birds will mate with these guys, but they'll also mate with these guys. And they chop down the habitat here, so we don't know. But we think that the orange birds and the red birds would mate with each other. At most points along the ring, the thing is, at most points along the ring, ring species behave as a single species. Everybody is happy to mate with everyone else. They produce hybrids of high fitness. But at one point in the ring, and in this case it's up here at the top where we've got hatch marks between the blue and the red population, at this point, individuals in the blue population and individuals in the red population meet each other, and they just start like, no, I don't recognize you. You're not the mate for me. So at that point in the ring, they are behaving as though they belong to two different species, even though at every other point in the ring, it seems like, blue will mate with green, and green will mate with yellow, and yellow will mate with orange, and orange will mate with red. So it depends on where in the ring you sample. So that's a challenge to the biological species concept. The other main area of difficulty with the biological species concept, of course, is What happens if there isn't any geographic overlap between the two populations you want to see belong to the same species? And this can happen. And so, yeah, everyone's probably seen on YouTube, you've seen like these guys, these superb birds of paradises in Papua New Guinea, and they do the crazy dances, and they're called like the happy face bird, and everyone digs them. But then a few years ago, in a little neighboring mountain valley, they discovered another population that are sort of morphologically a little different. They're sort of like the frowny face birds of paradise, and they have a slightly different dance. And people would love to apply the biological species concept to determine, do these things on the right belong to the same species as the things on the left? Do they recognize each other as potential mates? Will they hybridize under natural conditions? And the thing is, we don't know, we can't know, because they are geographically separated from each other. The things on the right have never met the things from the left. Could we capture them, some from the left and some from the right, and put them in a lab and see what they did? Yeah, we could do that, but that would not be, we would not be studying them under natural conditions anymore. So the biological species concept doesn't work when two populations are fully allopatric. Biological species concept requires at least a little bit of overlap in the range so that we can test, do these things interbreed when they come into contact? All good so far? Okay, so the biological species concept isn't perfect. That's okay. Many other species concepts have been advanced, and one of them is called the ecological species concept. So the ecological species concept says, okay, morphology can be misleading, and maybe reproductive isolation isn't always a useful criterion to use. Why don't we just classify species based on their ecological niche? In other words, based on the resources they use, the habitat they live in, the things that what they feed on, basically their lifestyle. And so using the ecological species concept, for example, this new species, ecological species of mosquito, has been identified. And so here we have like a typical above ground mosquito, and individuals of this species, this one lives in Europe, but we have the same ones here in North America. They live above ground, and females mostly take blood meals from birds. They feed on bird blood and use that to develop their eggs. Somehow, a subpopulation of this species of mosquito became trapped underground in the London subway system, London, England, the other London. And they have survived there. They have survived there by feeding on the blood of, British citizens who are just trying to take the subway to get to work. So they're now feeding on human blood, and they're now living underground instead of above ground. Their ecology is very different. And so just in a few decades, we've got this new species forming, at least according to the ecological species concept. None of these species concepts that I'm going to be discussing today are perfect, and none of them work in every situation. So one area where the ecological species concept, again, runs into problems is with organisms whose ecological niche changes a lot, even within the lifetime of the same individual. So think of a tadpole that's purely aquatic and living in the water versus a frog that's more amphibious and living on the water and the land. Ecology is very different, but the same individual could occupy both of these ecological niches in its life. Are we really going to say that these are two different species on the slide? The last species concept I want to talk about is the phylogenetic species concept. I think this is probably gaining more and more speed, more and more support. The phylogenetic species concept classifies species not based on their ecology or the way they look or even who they mate with, but based on evolutionary relationships. So we define a species, according to this species concept, as a group of populations with a very recent evolutionary history. Basically, a group of populations that are all more closely related to each other than they are to anything outside that species. I think This is probably the most broadly applicable species concept. The downside of the phylogenetic species concept, of course, is that we can only use it if we know the evolutionary relationships. And as we'll see in the next lecture cycle, there's a lot of groups of organisms that we don't really know the evolutionary relationships for, and it can be very time-consuming and expensive to work out those phylogenies, those relationships. So the take-home point, I guess, is that different species concepts might make different calls as to, like, are we dealing with one species of oriole or two in North America? So this is like a final exam question from a few years back. Take a look at this. There's two types of oriole in North America, and the ones in the east look like that, and the ones in the west look like that. So they look different from each other. They're not super closely related. So the Baltimore's orioles are more closely related to spotted orioles in Central America than they are to Bullock's. And Bullock's orioles are more closely related to streak-backed orioles than they are to Baltimore orioles. They do freely interbreed in this part of the world where their ranges overlap. And the hybrids are fit. The hybrids have normal fitness. They're not dead and they're not sterile. They're just fine. So which of these would say this is just one species of oriole? Lovely. Okay, excellent. Yes. The biological species concept would lump them together as a single species because they are not reproductively isolated. And the other two species concepts, for different reasons, would call them two different species. So very, very well done. And so different species concepts, whether it's ecological or morphological or phylogenetic or biological, different species concepts will reach different conclusions. Like if I say, how many species of happy-faced spider are we looking at here? Different species concepts might reach different conclusions. Different species concepts also require different information to get to those conclusions. So if you wanted to use the morphological species concept to answer this question, you would probably stick your hand up and say, wait a second, are there intermediate forms, or does every spider look like one of those four things? Like are they just like a cloud of spiders in phenotypic space, or four discrete clusters? But if you were interested in applying the biological species concept, you would already be running to the lab and trying to see if these things would mate with each other under natural conditions, or measuring the fitness of the hybrid. So different species concepts need different information. Good on species concepts then? Okay. Skip over that. Okay. I just want to discuss briefly the speciation process itself, or specifically, I want to talk about allopatric speciation, because most speciation happens in allopatry. I know in the readings, you've already read about the difference between allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation when two populations are overlapping in their geographic range. But most of the time, most speciation happens because a single population becomes isolated. And there's some sort of geographic barrier that prevents individuals from one subpopulation from exchanging genes with individuals from the other subpopulation. So most speciation happens in allopatry. And just to go over that briefly, imagine a case where there's a single population. It's what we call panmictic. That is, every individual in this population shares the same gene pool as everyone else. Everyone could mate with anyone else among these little purple circles. And now imagine the situation that some geographic barrier arises. So in this cartoon, the river changes course and cuts off one one bank of the river from the other, or maybe there's a mountain range, or maybe somebody builds a highway in between and these dots can't run across the highway, or maybe they're on two different continents and they drift apart. For whatever reason, we've got a geographic barrier. And so the things can't get across the barrier and they can't exchange genes. And when this happens, if we have two populations that are not connected by gene flow, then it's very likely that they are going to evolve in different directions from each other. This could be because of different selective environments. So maybe it's hotter on one side of the river than it is on the other side, and that favors different traits in this population and that population. So there could be differences in selection, pressure, or selective environment. Genetic drift also can cause populations to diverge. So maybe just through random chance, different alleles get fixed on the left side of the river than on the right side of the river. So given enough time, these two subpopulations will become more and more different from each other thanks to selection and drift. Or maybe different mutations arise in one population and don't happen in the other. They become different anyway. The populations diverge. And really, this is enough. Given enough time, under geographic separation, in the absence of gene flow, selection and drift and maybe mutation will cause these populations to become so different that we would now consider them different species. So this is really all we need for speciation to happen. We don't really need secondary contact or the removal of that barrier, but sometimes it happens. So maybe like the dots build a little bridge across the river, or the river smooths out again. For whatever reason, now the red dots and the blue dots are back in contact with each other, and we call that secondary contact. Now, secondary contact provides a nice opportunity for us to see whether speciation has happened or not. Right? Because now we can just see, okay, are the blue dots mating with the red dots ever? And if so, what's the fitness of their hybrid offspring? So secondary contact provides a nice opportunity to use the biological species concept to test, have they speciated or not? But do we need secondary contact for speciation to occur? Not really, not necessarily. And sometimes secondary contact can actually reverse the speciation process. So it all depends on when the secondary contact happens relative to the populations diverging from each other. Does the secondary contact happen really early on? Or does the secondary contact happen after they are, say, prezygotically or postzygotically isolated from each other? Because you can imagine a situation where the populations have been diverging for a little bit, but they haven't really become that different. And then they come back in secondary contact, and everybody maybe just resumes mating with everybody else. So if secondary contact happens fairly early on, then the two subpopulations just collapse back into one single population. They resume interbreeding with each other, and we call that fusion. And so even though the population may have started to diverge, it sort of snaps back together again. It sort of stops the speciation process. We started to develop into two different species, but we go back to one. They're no longer reproductively isolated. However, maybe secondary contact happens later than that. Maybe there's been more isolation occurring between the two populations. So if the red population and the blue population have become somewhat reproductively isolated from each other, then secondary contact could have a very different effect. So you remember from the reading that populations can be prezygotically isolated, or they can be postzygotically isolated, or both. So a prezygotic isolation mechanism would be like anything that prevents individuals from two populations from forming a gamete with each other, whether that's mating at different types of year, or singing different courtship songs, or having different courtship rituals, or using different habitats. Anything that prevents individuals from one population from mating and forming zygotes with another. The other type of reproductive isolation is if hybrids have low fitness. So something like, if like a goat and a sheep mate together, those offspring, they're called geep, but they usually die before they reach adulthood. That's a good way of having low fitness. Or if a horse and a donkey mate with each other, the mule offspring actually survive, but they're sterile, so again, the hybrids have low fitness. That's post-zygotic isolation. And which of those is more costly? Is it more costly to just look at somebody and say, oh, that's not my population, that's not a mate for me? Or is it more costly to mate with somebody from the other population and produce a hybrid offspring that then is sterile? Yeah. Exactly, yes. It is much more wasteful to produce a hybrid offspring and invest resources into them when they are never going to provide you with grand offspring. And so for that reason, if secondary contact happens after populations have become post-zygotically isolated, then we're in a situation where there is a risk of producing unfit hybrids. So if we get post-zygotic isolation, maybe we've evolved differences in chromosome number or something between the two populations, and hybrids are going to have low fitness, and the two populations now come back into contact, then there's a risk of wasting your parental investment if you produce hybrid offspring. For that reason, selection is going to favor individuals that preferentially mate with individuals from their own population. Selection is going to favor the evolution of prezygotic isolating mechanisms. And this idea is called reinforcement. And when do we see reinforcement? Only if there's post-zygotic isolation and then the populations come back into secondary contact. If that's the case, then we can predict that selection will favor prezygotic isolating mechanisms too, to avoid that wasteful investment in hybrids in the first place. So what does secondary contact do to the speciation process? It depends on when the secondary contact occurs. Secondary contact, if it happens really early on in divergence, it can just halt the speciation process. It can result in fusion. Secondary contact later on, especially if it's after post-zygotic isolating mechanisms have evolved, can accelerate the speciation process by really favoring the evolution of prezygotic isolating mechanisms, really cementing the reproductive isolation between these two populations. Okay, the very last thing I want to touch on is human effects on speciation. We think a lot about how humans are affecting rates of extinction in the natural world, but human-mediated environmental change can also affect rates of speciation. So one way that we can do this is by habitat fragmentation, say subdividing a large forest into two by building a highway in between them or something. And that can have the effect of reducing gene flow between populations, which, given enough time, can accelerate the speciation process. So like that, and evidence for this in big carnivores and big highways in California. Human activities can also have exactly the opposite effect, though. And if we change the environment of species that have evolved, say, prezygotic isolating mechanisms, so fish, for example, in the African Great Lakes, recognize their own species largely based on what color they are. But recent water pollution has increased turbidity in the Great Lakes, making it very difficult to tell like a red fish from a blue fish, with the result that all these new species are finally mating with everybody else and causing despeciation. So that's it for today. Remember 2 cycles on the OWL quiz this weekend. Thanks. See you next